How one nurse's stupid stitching technique stopped soldiers from bleeding out. The needle punched through skin that shouldn't have been moving. Sister Margaret Blackwell's hands were crimson to the wrists, her apron a butcher's canvas, and the boy on the table, couldn't have been 20, was convulsing so hard that 2 orderlies had to pin his shoulders while she worked. The femoral artery was torn, not severed, which somehow made it worse. Every heartbeat sent a fresh spray across her forearms. She'd already lost 3 men that morning to wounds just like this, watching them pale and fade while she did everything the textbook said to do. Everything correct, everything useless. So now, with her 4th dying soldier bucking against the leather restraints and screaming words that might have been his mother's name, Margaret Blackwell stopped following the rules. She threaded the silk backward, surface to depth instead of depth to surface, and pulled the tissue together in a pattern her supervising surgeon had called catastrophically ignorant when she'd tried to explain it 3 days ago. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The boy's convulsions eased into shuddering breaths. And in the sudden, ringing silence of the surgical tent, Margaret realized that every other nurse and surgeon had stopped working to stare at her hands. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this story has already pulled you into the battlefield, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss any forgotten acts of courage or impossible inventions, subscribe and join our front line of history. The mission's just getting started. Now, back to the scene. The field hospital sat 3 miles behind the Ardennes front, close enough that the ground trembled when the artillery batteries opened up, far enough that you could almost pretend the constant bass rumble was distant thunder. Almost. Sister Margaret Blackwell had been pretending a lot of things since her arrival from London 6 weeks ago. Pretending the smell of gangrene didn't make her gag anymore, pretending she couldn't hear the screams from the amputation tent, pretending that 22 years of age and 18 months of nursing school had somehow prepared her for this. None of it had. The surgical tent was a cathedral of suffering, 30 feet long and lit by kerosene lamps that turned everything the color of old bruises. 18 tables arranged in 2 rows, most of them occupied. The air tasted of carbolic acid, blood, and something else, something sweet and rotten that Margaret had learned was the smell of abdominal wounds. She'd learned a lot in 6 weeks. How to identify the whistle of incoming shells by pitch. How to keep her hands steady when a boy looked up at her with eyes that already knew he was dying. How to work for 36 hours straight on black coffee and the gnawing certainty that every man you saved just meant the ambulance drivers would bring you 3 more. Major Ellis Thornton, chief surgeon, was shouting before he'd even crossed the tent. What in God's name was that? He was a tall man, made taller by his blood-stained surgical gown and the way he seemed to fill any space he entered. 50 years old, trained at Guy's Hospital, veteran of the Boer War, and, according to the other nurses, possessor of the finest surgical hands in the British Army Medical Corps. He was also, Margaret had discovered, a man who believed there was exactly one correct way to perform every procedure, and that way was taught at Guy's Hospital in 1889. Margaret straightened from the table, her hands still red. The boy, Private Daniels, according to the tag on his torn uniform, was breathing steadily now, his color improving from fish-belly white to something almost human. The orderlies had released his shoulders. One of them was staring at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "He was bleeding out, sir," she said. "Standard technique wasn't controlling it." "So you invented a new one?" Thornton's voice could have frozen water. In the middle of surgery? Without consultation? There wasn't time for consultation. He had perhaps 2 minutes. Thornton moved to the table, his eyes scanning the wound site. Margaret had already applied the dressing, but the suture pattern would be visible during the next change. She watched his face as he examined her work, looking for the contempt she'd seen there before, during the staff meeting when she'd tried to explain her observations about suture tension and tissue planes. What she saw instead was calculation. "This pattern," Thornton said slowly, "is not in any surgical text I know." "No, sir. It appears to be inverted. You're using a subcuticular approach, but reversing the anchor points." His fingers traced the air above the wound, following the logic of stitches he couldn't yet see. The theory being that you're distributing tension across a wider tissue plane, preventing the artery from— "Yes, I see." He straightened, looked at her directly for what might have been the first time since she arrived. "How long have you been experimenting with this?" The truth felt dangerous, but lying felt worse. 3 days, sir. On cadavers." "You've been suturing corpses in your off hours?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" "Because I watched 17 men bleed to death in my first week," Margaret thought. "Because the standard technique fails on roughly 40% of arterial wounds, and nobody seems to care that we could do better. Because I spent 6 months before nursing school working in my father's butcher shop, and I learned more about tissue and tension from trimming pork loins than I ever did in classroom lectures about the sanctity of surgical tradition." She said, "Because the current method isn't working, sir." A shell exploded somewhere to the east, close enough to rattle the lamp chains. Nobody flinched. You learned not to flinch. Thornton stared at her for a long moment. Then, "Captain Morrison." A younger surgeon looked up from 2 tables over, where he was wrist-deep in a chest wound. "Sir?" "You will observe Sister Blackwell's suture technique on your next vascular case. Document the approach and the outcome." Thornton's eyes never left Margaret's face. "If Private Daniels survives the next 48 hours without complications, we will discuss this further. If he dies, or if the wound becomes septic, you and I will have a very different conversation about unauthorized experimentation on His Majesty's soldiers. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." "One more thing." Thornton leaned in slightly, his voice dropping below the ambient noise of moaning wounded and clanking surgical instruments. "If this works, if it genuinely works, you understand that it will change everything we think we know about arterial repair. You'll have surgeons twice your age insisting you're wrong. You'll have hospital boards questioning whether a woman should be making these decisions. You'll have military physicians who spent 20 years perfecting the current technique demanding proof that could take months to compile." He paused. "Are you prepared for that fight?" Margaret thought about Private Daniels, who was probably going to live now. She thought about the 3 men from this morning who hadn't. She thought about all the ones still coming, still bleeding, still dying in ambulances and on stretchers and in the mud between the trenches because nobody would question whether the old way was good enough. "Yes, sir," she said, "I am." Thornton nodded once, sharp and military. Then he turned away, already moving toward the next crisis, the next impossible decision. But over his shoulder, so quietly she almost missed it, he said, "Good. Because if you can prove this, Sister Blackwell, you might save more lives than all the generals combined." Margaret looked down at her hands, still shaking slightly, still stained red. Private Daniels was sleeping now, the kind of real sleep that meant his body trusted it would wake up. Across the tent, an orderly was wheeling in another stretcher, another torn body, another chance to get it right or watch someone die. She reached for a fresh pair of gloves. The artillery rumbled, the lamps swung, and Margaret Blackwell went back to work. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Cactics. The next case came within the hour. Captain Henry Walsh, 23rd Infantry, age 28, shrapnel wound to the left thigh with suspected arterial involvement. The ambulance crew had applied a tourniquet before loading him, which meant he still had perhaps an hour before tissue death became irreversible. He was conscious, gray-faced, gripping the edges of the stretcher hard enough that his knuckles showed white through the dirt. "How bad?" he asked Margaret as they transferred him to the table. His voice was steady, but his eyes knew the answer. "Bad enough that we're going to fix it," she said, which was the only honest response she had. Captain Morrison was already scrubbing in, moving with the efficient precision of a man who'd done this 200 times before. He was younger than Thornton, perhaps 35, with the kind of wire-rimmed spectacles that made him look more like a mathematics teacher than a battlefield surgeon. He'd trained at Edinburgh, which meant he had a different set of antiquated techniques to defend, but at least he seemed willing to watch. "Talk me through it," Morrison said as Margaret prepped the wound site, "before we open." She'd been preparing this explanation for 3 days, refining it every time she practiced on the dead men in the cooling tent, the ones who were past saving but could still teach. It felt ghoulish, but medicine had always been built on the bodies of the unlucky. Standard technique uses interrupted sutures, placed deep to superficial, relying on tissue compression to seal the vessel, Margaret said, her hands moving automatically through the preparation routine. Betadine swabs, field removal, exposure of the wound tract. It works reasonably well on clean lacerations where the vessel edges are intact, but most of what we see here— she gestured at the ragged tear in Walsh's femoral artery, visible now that she'd retracted the surrounding tissue— is blast trauma, irregular edges, tissue bruising, compromised vessel walls. "So you're proposing what, exactly?" Morrison had his hands poised over the instrument tray, ready to work. "Subcuticular continuous suture, but inverted. We start at the depth you'd normally finish and work outward. The tension distributes across multiple tissue planes instead of concentrating at the deepest point. The vessel wall gets support from the surrounding fascia, and the final throws lock everything in compression." She paused, needle ready. "In theory." "In theory," Morrison repeated. "And in practice?" "Private Daniels is still alive." "Sample size of 1. "Sample size of 1, Margaret agreed. "So let's make it 2. Walsh's eyes tracked between them, lucid enough to understand he was the experiment. "Do whatever keeps me walking," he said. "I've got a company to get back to." Margaret began. The first anchor point was the hardest, placing the needle precisely at the depth where vessel met fascia, where the tissue was most compromised but also most crucial. Too deep and she'd punch through to the posterior wall. Too shallow and the whole structure would collapse. Her hands remembered the resistance from the practice corpses, the slight give when the needle found the right plane. Thread through. First throw. The artery walls drew together, but gently, without the puckering she'd seen in failed standard repairs. "Tension," Morrison murmured, watching closely. "You're using maybe half what I would. The continuous pattern will accumulate it. By the final throw, you'll have the same total force, just distributed." "Show me." She worked outward, each stitch building on the last, the silk line forming a spiral pattern that looked wrong to every trained eye, but felt right in her hands. This was butcher's logic, the same principle her father used when trussing a roast, making sure the tension was even so the meat cooked uniformly. Meat and muscle, tissue and flesh. The body was just another kind of architecture. The bleeding stopped at the 7th stitch. Morrison leaned closer. That shouldn't have, but it did. Margaret placed the 8th stitch, then the 9th. The wound edges were kissing now, pink and clean, no gaps for infection to colonize. Standard technique would still be establishing hemostasis. We're already closing. "I need to see the tissue planes. After it heals, if we expose it now, we'll compromise the repair." It was a calculated risk, denying him the satisfaction of immediate verification. But Margaret had learned that men like Morrison, men who genuinely wanted to understand, would respect the science more than the ego. He'd wait. He'd watch Walsh recover or decline, and then he'd make his judgment. The final throw took 30 seconds. Margaret tied it off, applied the dressing, and stepped back. 18 minutes from incision to closure. Standard technique averaged 45. Walsh's color was already improving. Morrison removed his gloves slowly, his eyes never leaving the wound site. "If this holds," he said quietly, You've just made every surgical text in the British Empire obsolete. Just the chapters on vascular repair, Margaret said. Everything else is probably fine. He laughed, brief and startled, the sound of a man confronting something he hadn't expected to find. You've got a gift for understatement, sister. I've got a gift for thread tension. The understatement is self-defense. Over the next 12 hours, Margaret performed the modified suture technique 4 more times. 2 arterial wounds, 1 complex laceration involving multiple vessels, 1 that Morrison handed her specifically to see if she could replicate the success. All 4 patients stabilized. All 4 survived the immediate post-operative period. By dawn, word had spread through the medical staff. The reactions broke along predictable lines. The younger surgeons, the ones who'd trained after the Boer War, who'd seen enough horror to question whether tradition was the same as truth, watched with cautious interest. The older generation, Thornton's contemporaries, ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. Major Wickham, who'd served in India for 20 years, called it voodoo nursing within Margaret's hearing. Colonel Ashford Kent suggested that any positive outcomes were likely due to natural healing aided by youth and constitution rather than stitch placement. But the patients kept living. By the end of the 2nd day, Private Daniels was sitting up and asking for food. By the 3rd, Captain Walsh was demanding to be released back to duty, a request Thornton denied with the kind of profanity that suggested he was actually impressed by the man's recovery rate. And Margaret kept refining the technique. She worked in stolen hours, between shifts and during the brief periods when the ambulances stopped coming. The cooling tent became her laboratory, a grim classroom where the dead could still teach. She practiced on corpses with different body types, different wound patterns, different degrees of tissue damage. She learned that the technique worked best on medium-gauge vessels, that extremely small arteries required a modified approach, that the thread type mattered more than she'd initially thought. Silk was good. Catgut was better for certain applications. Wire, which one surgeon suggested, was absolutely wrong. She documented everything in a leather notebook she'd bought in London before the war, when she still thought nursing would involve more thermometers and fewer amputations. Sketches of suture patterns, notes on tissue response, outcome data organized by wound type and patient demographics. It was Morrison who found her in the cooling tent on the 4th night, hunched over a cadaver with a headlamp and a needle. "You know this is slightly insane," he said from the doorway. Margaret didn't look up. She was working on a particularly challenging repair, a wound that had severed not just the artery, but also the surrounding nerve bundle. The kind of injury that usually meant amputation because nobody could restore blood flow without causing permanent paralysis. Insanity would be not trying to improve. Thornton's calling a medical board review for tomorrow morning. Every surgeon with rank higher than captain. They're going to want to see your data. I have data. They're going to want to see you fail. Now she looked up. Morrison's face was backlit by the doorway, his expression unreadable. But his voice carried something that might have been warning or might have been solidarity. "Will I?" she asked. "Fail? I don't know. The outcomes are undeniable, but you're asking them to abandon 30 years of practice, asking them to accept that he stopped, that Margaret finished, and a junior nurse at that, has discovered something they missed. Yes." She turned back to the corpse, made the final stitch, tied it off. The pattern was perfect now, elegant in its efficiency. It would have saved this man if he'd received it in time. "Then they'll have to decide," she said, "whether their pride is worth more than soldiers' lives." Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then, "For what it's worth, I'm going to argue for you tomorrow. The technique works. Everything else is ego. Thank you." Don't thank me yet. Thornton's on your side, and that counts for a lot. But Colonel Ashford Kent outranks him, and Ashford Kent thinks women should be doing anything more complicated than changing bedpans. Margaret stripped off her gloves, closed her notebook. The cooling tent was cold, hence the name, and she could see her breath in the lamplight. Around her, arranged on wooden pallets, lay 17 bodies waiting for burial detail. 17 men who died of wounds she might have saved them from if she'd figured this out sooner. "Captain Morrison," she said, "I didn't come here to change bedpans. I came here to save lives. If Colonel Ashford Kent has a problem with that, he can take it up with the next soldier who would have bled out under his preferred technique." Morrison smiled, brief and genuine. "You're going to be remarkable or court-martialed, possibly both." "I'll settle for remarkable." He left. Margaret extinguished the headlamp, gathered her notes, and walked back toward the nurses' quarters through the pre-dawn darkness. Somewhere to the east, the artillery was starting up again. Morning bombardment, regular as clockwork. The sound of men dying in ways that no surgical technique could fix. But some men, she thought, some men she could save. Tomorrow should have to prove it. Part 3. Revelation and Collapse. The medical board convened at 0800 hours in what had been a farmhouse kitchen before the war. Now it was the hospital's administrative center, complete with maps, filing cabinets, and a long oak table scarred by years of hard use. 7 surgeons sat around that table, most of them old enough to be Margaret's father. All of the men who'd earned their positions through decades of service and the accumulated weight of military hierarchy. Margaret stood at the foot of the table, her notebook open, her hands steady, despite the tremor that wanted to start in her fingers. Colonel Ashford Kent spoke first. He was a heavy man, gray-haired and gray-faced, with the kind of mustache that suggested he'd been trying to intimidate subordinates since the Victorian era. "Sister Blackwell, you understand why we've called this review?" "Yes, sir. You wish to evaluate the modified suture technique I've been employing for arterial repairs." Modified technique is generous phrasing. What I understand from the reports is that you've been disregarding established medical practice in favor of, what would you call it, intuition? Morrison started to speak, but Thornton cut him off with a gesture. "Let her answer," Thornton said. Margaret met Ashford Kent's eyes. "Not intuition, sir. Observation. The standard interrupted suture technique has a documented failure rate of approximately 40% on blast-related arterial wounds. I observed this failure pattern repeatedly during my first week here. I then spent considerable time analyzing why the failures occurred and developing an alternative approach that addresses the underlying mechanical issues." "You spent considerable time," Ashford Kent repeated. "How much formal training do you have in vascular surgery, sister?" 18 months of nursing school, sir, plus 6 weeks in the field." "And you believe this qualifies you to reinvent procedures that have been standard practice since before you were born?" The room was very quiet. Margaret could hear rain starting against the windows, the distant rumble of supply trucks on the muddy road outside. "I believe," she said carefully, "that outcomes matter more than precedent. Since implementing the modified technique, I've performed 16 arterial repairs. All 16 patients survived the immediate postoperative period. 14 have been discharged. 2 are still recovering but show no signs of complications. Under standard technique, we'd expect 6 to 7 fatalities from that same cohort." Major Wickham leaned forward. "Coincidence?" "You've simply had a fortunate run of less severe wounds. I've documented wound severity for each case." Margaret opened her notebook, slid it across the table. 3 of the 16 were classified as likely fatal by the admitting surgeon. All 3 survived. The notebook made its way around the table. Margaret watched their faces as they read, skepticism giving way to interest in some cases, hardening into resistance in others. Colonel Ashford Kent barely glanced at the pages before pushing the book toward Morrison. "Captain Morrison," Ashford Kent said, "you've observed this technique firsthand. Your assessment." Morrison chose his words carefully. "The outcomes have been remarkable. The technique itself represents a fundamental shift in our understanding of tissue mechanics and tension distribution. If the success rate holds across a larger sample— If, Ashford Kent interrupted, quite. And what happens, Sister Blackwell, when you encounter a complication you can't handle? When this experimental approach fails and a soldier dies because you were too arrogant to follow proper procedure? Then I'll return to standard technique, Margaret said. But sir, men are already dying under standard technique. If there's even a chance this works— A chance? You're gambling with lives based on a chance? No, sir. I'm gambling with lives based on data. 16 cases, 16 survivors. That's not chance, that's evidence. It's insufficient evidence. You could perform this procedure 1,000 times and still not prove it's superior to the current standard. Medical science requires rigor, controlled studies, peer review. Medical science, Margaret said, and felt the words coming out harder than she intended, requires that we try to save the patient in front of us, not the theoretical patient in next year's journal article. The silence that followed was dangerous. Thornton cleared his throat. Gentlemen, I think we're losing sight of the central question. The technique works. We have objective proof of that. The question is whether we have the courage to adopt it officially. The question, Ashford Kent said coldly, is whether we're going to let a junior nurse dictate surgical policy for the entire medical corps based on 6 weeks of field experience. The question, Morrison said, his voice cutting across the growing tension, is whether we care more about protocol or survival rates. That's enough, Captain. But Morrison wasn't finished. With respect, Colonel, I've been in this war for 8 months. I've watched men die from wounds we should have been able to repair. If Sister Blackwell has found a better way, and the evidence strongly suggests she has, then we have a moral obligation to teach it to every surgeon in the theater. You're out of line. I'm stating facts, sir. Ashford Kent rose from his chair, his face darkening. This board is dismissed. Sister Blackwell, you are to cease all unauthorized surgical procedures immediately and return to standard nursing duties. Any further experimentation will result in disciplinary action up to and including removal from service. Is that understood? Margaret felt the floor drop out from under her. Sir, is that understood? She wanted to argue, wanted to slam her notebook down on the table and demand they explain how protecting their egos was worth more than soldiers' lives. Wanted to scream that she just saved 16 men who would have died and they were punishing her for it. Instead, she said, "Yes, sir. Good. Dismissed." She walked out into the rain, her notebook clutched against her chest, her eyes burning with fury and frustration and the terrible knowledge that she was right, had proven she was right, and it didn't matter because the men who made the decisions cared more about tradition than truth. Morrison caught up with her outside the nurses' quarters. "Don't," she said before he could speak. "Don't tell me it'll be all right, or that I should be patient, or that change takes time. I just saved 16 lives and got reprimanded for it." "I was going to tell you," Morrison said quietly, "that I'm sorry. You deserved better than that." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Deserving doesn't seem to count for much." "No, it doesn't." He hesitated, rain soaking through his uniform. "But Thornton's not done fighting. He's going to take this to medical command in London, bypass Ashford Kent entirely. It'll take weeks, maybe months, but how many men die in months?" Margaret asked. "How many soldiers bleed out while we wait for medical command to file the proper paperwork?" Morrison had no answer for that. She went inside, past the rows of narrow bunks where exhausted nurses collapsed between shifts, into the small supply closet she'd claimed as a private space. She sat on a crate of bandages, her notebook open on her lap, and stared at the pages of careful documentation that meant nothing to the men who mattered. 16 cases, 16 survivors. Not enough. She stayed there until the sound of ambulances announced the next wave of wounded, the next impossible choices, the next chance to save someone or watch them die. Then she closed the notebook, tucked it into her locker, and went back to work, following orders, using standard technique, watching the bleeding that her method would have stopped. It lasted 3 hours. The patient was a lieutenant, 24 years old, shrapnel to the right thigh, femoral artery compromised. Margaret assisted Major Wickham with the repair, handing him instruments and watching him place the interrupted sutures exactly as the textbooks prescribed. Deep to superficial, maximum compression at the vessel depth. Everything correct. Everything useless. The bleeding continued, seeping around the sutures, the lieutenant's blood pressure dropping despite the transfusion. Wickham placed 2 more sutures. Then 3 more. The wound was becoming a pincushion of failed attempts, the tissue so traumatized by repeated needle passes that it was starting to tear. "He's not responding," the assisting nurse said, her voice tight. "I can see that." Wickham's hands were steady, but Margaret heard the frustration underneath. He was doing everything right, following every rule, and it wasn't working, because sometimes the rules were wrong. "Sir," Margaret said quietly, "permission to try the modified technique." "Denied. You heard Colonel Ashford Kent. The patient is dying." "Then he's dying. That's war, sister. Not every man makes it home." Margaret stared at the lieutenant's face, gray and slack, his breathing shallow. 24 years old. Probably had a girl waiting for him, parents who still thought of him as their little boy, friends who'd promised to meet him after the war for a pint and a laugh about the time they survived hell together. 24 years old and bleeding out because protocol mattered more than his life. She reached for the suture tray. "Sister Blackwell." "He's going to die anyway," Margaret said, already threading the needle. "Colonel Ashford Kent can court-martial me after." "The patient is dying." "Then he's dying. That's war, sister. Not every man makes it home." Margaret stared at the lieutenant's face, gray and slack, his breathing shallow. 24 years old. Probably had a girl waiting for him, parents who still thought of him as their little boy, friends who'd promised to meet him after the war for a pint and a laugh about the time they survived hell together. 24 years old and bleeding out because protocol mattered more than his life. She reached for the suture tray. "Sister Blackwell." "He's going to die anyway," Margaret said, already threading the needle. "Colonel Ashford Kent can court-martial me after." Wickham grabbed her wrist. "Stand down. That's an order." "With respect, sir, no." She pulled free, bent over the wound, placed the first inverted stitch at exactly the right depth. The muscle memory was perfect. 18 practice runs on cadavers, 16 successful field repairs, countless hours of refinement. Her hands knew this pattern better than they knew prayer. Second stitch. Third. The bleeding slowed. "Sister, you are directly violating. I'm saving him." Fourth stitch. Fifth. The artery walls drew together cleanly, the tissue accepting the tension instead of tearing under it. Sixth. Seventh. Eighth. The bleeding stopped. Margaret tied off the final throw, applied the dressing, and stepped back. The lieutenant's color was already improving, his blood pressure stabilizing on the monitor. Wickham stared at her, his face a mix of anger and something that might have been awe. "You just ended your career." "I just saved his life," Margaret said. "It was worth it." Part 4. The Alliance and the Turning Point. The arrest came 30 minutes later. Military police, 2 corporals who looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation, escorted Margaret from the surgical tent to a supply building that had been converted into a holding area. They were polite about it, apologetic even, but firm. Colonel's orders. Disobeying a direct command. Insubordination in a military medical facility. Margaret went quietly, too exhausted to fight, and sat on a wooden stool in what had probably been a grain storage room before the war. The corporals positioned themselves outside the door, close enough to prevent escape, but far enough to pretend she wasn't technically under guard. She'd been there perhaps an hour when Thornton arrived. He dismissed the guards with a gesture, stepped inside, and closed the door. For a moment, he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The lieutenant's name," Thornton said finally, "is David Pemberton. He's an architecture student from Canterbury, engaged to a teacher named Alice Morrow. His parents own a bookshop." He paused. "He's going to live, thanks to you. And now I'm going to be court-martialed, thanks to Colonel Ashford Kent. Probably." Thornton sat on a crate across from her, his surgical gown still blood-stained from the day's work. "I've been a military surgeon for 27 years. I've served in 3 wars, performed thousands of procedures, trained dozens of young doctors. And in all that time, Sister Blackwell, I have never seen anyone display the combination of brilliance and stupidity you showed today. Sir, I'm not finished. You were ordered to stand down. You disobeyed." In any other context, I'd call that unconscionable. Medical discipline exists for good reasons. We can't have nurses or junior surgeons making independent decisions that contradict their superiors, because that way lies chaos and dead patients. Margaret said nothing. There was nothing to say. "However," Thornton continued, "this isn't any other context. You were ordered to let a man die rather than use a technique that has proven repeatedly to be superior to our current standard. You were ordered to prioritize protocol over patient welfare, and when faced with that choice, you chose correctly." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded paper. "This is a letter I'm sending to Medical Command in London tonight. It contains a full account of your modified technique, supporting data from all 17 cases, and testimony from Captain Morrison and myself regarding the efficacy of the approach. I'm also including a detailed description of today's incident with Lieutenant Pemberton, making it clear that you acted in direct contradiction to my personal guidance and that Major Wickham had the situation under control." Margaret blinked. "Sir?" "I'm covering your insubordination," Thornton said, "by making it seem like I authorized your intervention without informing Wickham. It's a lie. It might not hold up under scrutiny, but it gives London an excuse to focus on the technique rather than the discipline problem. Why would you?" "Because you're right." He said it simply, without qualification. "Your technique is better. Not maybe better, not possibly better, definitively, provably better. And if the Army Medical Corps can't adapt to that truth because of hierarchy and tradition, then we deserve to lose this war." Margaret felt something crack in her chest, the tight knot of fury and frustration that had been building since the board review. She'd expected condemnation, maybe sympathy, but not this, not vindication from the man whose authority she'd just undermined. Her voice came out rough. "I thought you'd want me gone. Oh, I want you terrified of ever disobeying orders again," Thornton said. "But I also want you teaching this technique to every surgeon in the European theater. Fortunately, those goals aren't mutually exclusive." He stood, moved toward the door, then paused. "3 things, sister. First, Lieutenant Pemberton's family will never know how close they came to losing him. As far as they'll know, the surgery went exactly as planned." "Yes, sir." "Second, if Medical Command approves this technique, which they will because I'm going to make it impossible for them to refuse, you'll be reassigned to a training facility in London. You'll spend the next 6 months teaching your method to every surgeon we can pull from the front. It'll be exhausting, frustrating work, and you'll have to deal with men who resent being taught by someone half their age. I can handle that. Third," Thornton's voice went very quiet, "16 men are alive because of you. 17 now. That number is going to grow into the hundreds, probably thousands, as this technique spreads. You will never receive a medal for it. There will be no official recognition, no promotion, no grand commendation. The best you can hope for is that your name appears in a footnote of some surgical text 10 years from now, attributed correctly for once. He opened the door, letting in the sound of rain and distant artillery. But those men will go home to their families. They'll have children and grandchildren. They'll live full lives instead of dying on tables in muddy tents in France. And they'll live because you had the courage to trust your hands more than our rules. He looked back at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Margaret saw something like respect in his eyes. That's the real medal, sister, the one that matters. Then he was gone, and Margaret was alone with her thoughts and the distant rumble of war. The court-martial never happened. Medical command in London, faced with Thornton's letter and the undeniable evidence of improved survival rates, made the only logical choice. Within 2 weeks, the Blackwell method was officially adopted as standard procedure for arterial repairs across all British medical facilities. Within a month, Margaret was indeed reassigned to London, where she spent 12-hour days teaching her technique to surgeons who ranged from eager students to hostile critics. But before she left, there was one final case. Captain Morrison found her in the cooling tent on her last night at the field hospital. She was saying goodbye to the corpses, in a strange way, the silent teachers who'd made everything possible. "There's someone you should meet," Morrison said. He led her to the recovery ward, past rows of wounded men at various stages of healing. Some would be going home. Some would be going back to the front. All of them had stories that would outlast the war. Lieutenant David Pemberton was sitting up in bed, his leg bandaged but healing well. He looked up as they approached, his face breaking into a smile that was slightly loopy from morphine. "This is her?" he asked Morrison. "This is her." Pemberton reached out his hand, and Margaret took it carefully, mindful of his injuries. His grip was strong. "They told me you saved my life," he said. "That you did something dangerous and brilliant and got in trouble for it." "They exaggerated the trouble part," Margaret said, "though it wasn't really true." "I'm going to marry Alice in 6 months," Pemberton continued, his words slightly slurred but sincere. "We're going to open our own architectural firm in Canterbury. Design houses that help people rebuild after all this ends." He squeezed her hand. "I wanted you to know that. Wanted you to know your risk meant something, meant everything." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "You would have survived anyway. Major Wickham is an excellent surgeon." "Captain Morrison says otherwise. Says you broke the rules because the rules were wrong." Pemberton smiled. "Thank you for being wrong in the right way." Later, walking back through the rain toward her quarters for the last time, Morrison said, "He's not the only one, you know. Every man you saved is going to have a moment like that. A wedding, a career, children, grandchildren. You've changed entire family trees that haven't even started growing yet." "I just did what made sense," Margaret said. "That's the problem with people like you," Morrison replied. "You think courage is common. It's not. Most of us see the right path and find reasons not to take it. You saw it and walked straight ahead. Consequences be damned. I got lucky. Thornton supported me. Thornton's supporting you because you gave him no choice. You made the truth so obvious that even the system had to acknowledge it." He paused at the entrance to the nurses' quarters. "One last question, if I may. When you were standing there with Wickham ordering you to stop and Pemberton dying in front of you, was there any doubt in your mind? Any moment where you thought maybe you should obey?" Margaret considered this, remembered the weight of the needle in her hand, the choice crystallizing into absolute clarity. "No," she said, "no doubt at all." Morrison nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he already knew. "That's what makes you dangerous, Sister Blackwell, and what makes you necessary." He saluted, an ironic gesture given that she was technically his subordinate, and walked away into the rain. Margaret stood there for a moment, listening to the artillery and the rain and the distant sounds of men being kept alive by techniques both old and new. Tomorrow should take the train to London. Tomorrow should begin the long work of teaching others what her hands had learned. Tomorrow the war would continue without her, though her method would remain. But tonight she was still here. Still part of this muddy, bloody, impossible place where people died and people were saved, and sometimes the difference came down to one person's willingness to trust that there was a better way. She thought about Lieutenant Pemberton and his future wedding, about Private Daniels and Captain Walsh and all the others, about the men she'd learned from in the cooling tent whose deaths had taught her how to prevent more deaths, about the fact that somewhere in Canterbury, a bookshop owner's son was going to live to design buildings that would outlast the war. That was enough. That had to be enough. Margaret Blackwell went inside, packed her small bag, and prepared to go teach the world how to save itself, one stitch at a time. Part 5. Resolution and Legacy. The London training facility occupied a converted hospital in Bloomsbury, 3 stories of Victorian brick that smelled of carbolic acid and institutional tea. Margaret arrived in early December 1917, stepping off the train into a city that seemed both familiar and alien. Streets she'd walked before the war, now filled with women in factory uniforms and wounded soldiers learning to navigate the world with missing limbs. The training room was on the 2nd floor, a former surgical theater with tiered seating and a central demonstration table. 30 surgeons, all men, all significantly older than Margaret, sat in those tiers the first morning she walked in. Their faces ranged from curious to contemptuous, but mostly they looked tired. These were men pulled from the front for a week's training, men who'd seen enough horror that one more indignity, being taught by a woman barely out of nursing school, barely registered. "Gentlemen," Margaret said, placing her leather notebook on the demonstration table, "I'm going to show you how to stop arterial bleeding in half the time with twice the success rate. You're going to think it's wrong. You're going to want to argue. I'm asking you to watch first and argue later." Fair enough? A major in the front row, gray-haired with a jaw like granite, raised his hand. "Is it true you were nearly court-martialed for this technique?" "Yes." "Good," the major said. "Means you believe in it enough to risk something. I'm listening." For 6 months, Margaret taught. She demonstrated the technique hundreds of times on practice materials and on supervised surgical cases at nearby field hospitals. She explained the mechanics of tension distribution, the importance of tissue planes, the subtle differences that meant success or failure. She answered the same questions repeatedly, with patience she didn't always feel. She faced down skeptics and won over converts, and learned that teaching was its own kind of battlefield. Some of the surgeons took to the technique immediately, their hands finding the rhythm after just a few attempts. Others struggled, fighting years of ingrained habits. A few refused to learn, insisting that the old ways were sufficient, though even they couldn't argue with the survival statistics that Margaret presented at each session. By spring 1918, the Blackwell method had been taught to over 300 surgeons. Those surgeons returned to field hospitals across France, Belgium, Italy, carrying the technique with them like a weapon against death. Reports started filtering back to London. Improved survival rates, fewer complications, soldiers walking away from wounds that would have killed them months earlier. Margaret documented everything, compiling case studies and outcome data, building the foundation for what would eventually become the standard reference text on arterial repair. But the documentation felt secondary to the letters. They arrived weekly, sometimes daily, notes from surgeons in the field describing successful procedures. Thank you letters from families who'd been told their sons or husbands were expected to die, only to receive word that they'd survived. Sometimes the letters came from the soldiers themselves, written in shaky handwriting from hospital beds, expressing gratitude to a woman they'd never met. Margaret kept them all in a wooden box her mother had sent from home. She didn't read them often. It felt too much like pride, too much like claiming credit for what was really just logic and necessity. But sometimes, on the difficult days when the teaching seemed endless and the war showed no signs of stopping, she'd open the box and remind herself why it mattered. Lieutenant David Pemberton wrote twice. The first letter came in January. Dear Sister Blackwell, I'm writing this from a hospital in Dover where I'm undergoing physical therapy for my leg. The doctors tell me I'll have a limp, but I'll walk. They also tell me I owe that to you specifically. Alice visited last week. We've set the date for June. I'm enclosing an invitation, though I understand if you can't attend. I simply wanted you to know that your courage bought me a future. I intend to make the most of it. With profound gratitude, L.T. David Pemberton. The second letter came in July. Sister Blackwell, the wedding was perfect. Alice cried, my mother cried, I nearly cried. We're returning to Canterbury next month to start our firm. I wanted you to have the enclosed photograph. That's me standing on my own two legs, no cane, smiling like an idiot. That's Alice in white, looking far too beautiful to have agreed to marry me. And that's my future, made possible because you trusted your hands more than their rules. Thank you for my life. David Pemberton. Margaret pinned the photograph to the wall of her small office in the training facility. A young man in a suit standing next to a woman in a wedding dress, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Behind them, blurry but visible, were the spires of Canterbury Cathedral, ancient and enduring. It became her touchstone. When surgeons challenged her authority, she'd glance at that photograph. When the teaching felt impossible, when the war ground on with no end in sight, when she wondered if any of this mattered in the face of industrial slaughter, she'd look at David Pemberton standing on his own legs and remember that every individual life saved was a victory against the machinery of death. The war ended in November 1918. Margaret was still in London, still teaching, when the news came through. She walked out into streets filled with celebrating crowds, people crying and laughing and holding each other, church bells ringing across the city. The war was over. The impossible, eternal war was finished. She thought about all the men who'd gone home because of a stitching technique developed in a cooling tent. She thought about the ones who wouldn't be coming home, saved or unsaved, because war was war, and some wounds couldn't be repaired. She thought about the strange arithmetic of it all. Her method had saved thousands, but millions had died anyway, and both numbers were incomprehensibly large. She went back to her office and wrote the final entry in her leather notebook. November 11, 1918. The war has ended. Final estimated impact of modified arterial repair technique. 3,847 documented survivors who were expected to die from vascular wounds. True number likely higher, accounting for undocumented cases and procedures performed by surgeons who learned the technique informally. I do not know if this constitutes success. I know only that 3,847 families will not receive telegrams informing them of deaths. 3,470 futures remain possible. In the calculus of war, this is a small number. In the calculus of human life, it is everything. The technique will outlast the war. That was always the goal, to create something permanent in the face of impermanence, to answer horror with precision, to trust that better methods exist if we're brave enough to find them. I am grateful beyond words for the opportunity to have tried. She closed the notebook for the last time. The years after the war passed quickly.
Margaret returned to active nursing, working in civilian hospitals where the pace was slower but the problems no less complex. She published the definitive text on her technique in 1921, crediting Morrison and Thornton extensively, though both men insisted her name should be primary. It became required reading in medical schools across Britain and eventually Europe and America. She never married, though there were offers. Never had children of her own, though she trained hundreds of surgeons and nurses who went on to save countless lives. Her legacy was measured in techniques taught, in knowledge passed forward, in the steady accumulation of survival rates that slowly transformed emergency medicine from an art of desperation into a science of hope. In 1924, she received a letter from Canterbury. David Pemberton, now a successful architect, writing to tell her that his wife had given birth to a daughter. They'd named her Margaret, if that was all right. It was more than all right. It was perfect. In 1947, at the age of 52, Margaret Blackwell was invited to speak at a medical conference in London. The topic was wartime innovation, and specifically the development of rapid trauma response techniques. She stood at a podium in front of 300 physicians and told them the story. The cooling tent, the notebooks, the defiant surgery that had nearly ended her career. "I was very young," she said toward the end, "and very certain I was right. That certainty saved lives. It also violated every norm of military hierarchy and medical tradition. I'm often asked if I would do it again, knowing the risks. The answer is yes, without hesitation." She paused, looking out at the audience.
But I'm also asked, what would I tell young medical professionals today who see better methods but fear the consequences of challenging authority? And my answer is this: document everything. Build your case with data, not emotion. Find allies among those with power. Be respectful but unflinching in your advocacy for patients. And if, after all that, you're still forced to choose between protocol and survival, choose survival. Accept the consequences, but choose survival. The applause was sustained and genuine. Afterward, a young surgeon approached her, a woman, perhaps 30 years old, with nervous hands and determined eyes. "Sister Blackwell," she said, "I have an idea about post-operative infection rates. It contradicts current practice, but I think it could work." Margaret smiled. "Then document it. Test it. Build your evidence. And when you're ready, trust your hands." "What if I'm wrong?" "Then you'll learn from being wrong, and the next idea will be better." "But what if you're right?" The young surgeon nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression, the look of someone deciding to be brave. Margaret Blackwell died in 1963, at the age of 68. The obituaries noted her contributions to vascular surgery, her work training multiple generations of medical professionals, her role in reducing battlefield mortality during the First World War. They were respectful and accurate, recounting the facts of a life dedicated to healing. But they couldn't capture the moment in a surgical tent when a young nurse decided that tradition mattered less than truth. They couldn't convey the weight of a needle in practiced hands, or the sound of breathing resuming after bleeding stopped. They couldn't document the thousands of invisible futures, weddings and careers and children and grandchildren that existed because one person trusted her observations more than her fear. In Canterbury, a retired architect named David Pemberton read the obituary. He was 70 years old, with 3 children and 5 grandchildren, a successful firm that had rebuilt dozens of neighborhoods, a life that should never have happened. He walked to his study, opened a drawer, and pulled out a faded photograph, a young nurse in a surgical tent, caught by some war photographer in a moment between crises. She was bent over a patient, her hands sure and steady, her face focused with a kind of concentration that doesn't recognize anything beyond the work. Someone had survived because of those hands, Many someones. Enough someones that their collective futures added together amounted to a kind of immortality. David Pemberton placed the photograph on his desk next to the picture of his daughter Margaret and her 2 children. 3 generations made possible by one woman's refusal to accept that death was inevitable. In the photograph, Sister Margaret Blackwell's hands remained poised above the wound, forever in the act of saving a life. The needle caught the lamplight, silk thread gleaming, the pattern already forming in her mind. Inverted, revolutionary, perfect. The bleeding would stop. It always stopped when the technique was right and the hands were sure. That was the legacy. Not fame or recognition or medals, just the simple, profound fact. The bleeding stopped, and the soldiers went home.